welcome to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas, a podcast on the lesser-known aspects of religion and belief.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Religion Off the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Robin Douglas, and today I'm pleased to welcome to the show Jonathan Machnee, who is a researcher into the fascinating but still little understood subject of autism and religion, and Christianity in particular. He runs, amongst other things, the Christianity on the Spectrum podcast. Welcome, Jonathan, and thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Looking forward to this conversation.
Well, perhaps we can start with the background. As I say, this is still a little understood, or an insufficiently understood subject. So let me kick off by asking you how you came to be doing this research.
Yeah, so I guess it started when I was 16, and that was when I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. At the time, it was called Asperger's syndrome. Now it's just called Autism 1. And that was kind of a really big revelation for me. And it kind of completely changed the way that I saw myself and the way that I understood life and everything like that. And yeah, so I was raised in a conservative evangelical household. I call it conservative evangelical. It was actually Mennonite Brethren. I was raised in rural Canada, out west in Saskatchewan. Mennonites are pretty common there. The joke with Mennonite Brethren is MB stands for mostly Baptist. So I just tell people as conservative evangelical, and that mostly fills in the gaps. I wasn't a particularly good Mennonite because at age 18, I joined the Army. So I went to the Royal Military College of Canada to study computer engineering. I didn't really think about autism and Christianity very much until I left the faith myself. So I pretty rapidly deconstructed once I got to college and left Christianity altogether. And then I met a whole bunch of other autistic people at an event for autistic students that was being held by Queen's University, which is co-located just across a causeway from the Royal Military College. So Queen's University is a large civilian university in Canada, in Kingston, Ontario. And so I went to a meeting for autistic students, and I met a lot of other guys who were almost exactly like me. They were also autistic. They also were raised in a similar religious environment, and they also came to almost the same conclusions as me and had almost the same story. And I thought, that's really weird. Why is this happening? Like why? It's odd if it happens once, or it's not odd if it happens once. It's odd if it happens twice, but if it happens 10 times, that's sort of a trend. And so I really wanted to figure out whether or not this was just a weird anomaly in my little microcosm, or if this was indicative of broader trends. And so I went and I started looking up research to do with autism and religion. And I found that it wasn't that there wasn't any studies. There were a few of them. And they all seemed to suggest that there was some sort of negative correlation between religiosity and autism. But the reasons that they gave and the way they described it just didn't make sense to me at all. Some of the reasons they gave were still to this day, I'm really not sure what they were thinking. I think there is sort of a problem in academic autism research that when you start going into religion, you kind of have a case in which you either understand religion or you understand autism, or you understand autism but don't understand religion. And so, yeah, you get a lot of weird assumptions about what religion actually is. And religion was still something I was very interested in. So autistic people, we developed these really hyper-specific fields of interest and fields of inquiry. And mine was Christian origins. I was very interested in Christianity between the 1st and the 5th century, just understanding it. And so my understanding of what religion is and how it functions and how it operates was very different from, I guess, the academic autism researchers. And so I just thought, this is, like, I think they're wrong, but there is this negative correlation. So why is there this negative correlation? And yeah, then I just started my own self-directed research, basically. And that's culminated so far in I've data mined around 26,000 online autistic Christians and ex-Christians, and I've done in-person long-form interviews with over 450. It's been kind of 10 years of continuous self-directed research of me just trying to understand this relationship between autism and Christianity.
Okay. And it's not easy to get the research methodology right, is it? Because the sort of methodology that you might apply to neurotypical people doesn't necessarily carry over.
Yeah, so there are a lot of like really weird nuances. And so one of them is a difficulty with getting accurate results from surveys for autistic people, because autistic people are typically very like conscientious, very precise in what they want to do and what they want to express, and they are very aware of what they're trying to answer. And you get a situation in which, let's say you create a survey and you send it to autistic people, and the survey asks something like, do you accept the Nicene Creed or something like that, or do you affirm the Nicene Creed? You will get people who, for all intents and purposes, do affirm the Nicene Creed. So they would be a standard sort of Orthodox Christian. But a lot of the autistic people will say no, they don't affirm it. And when you ask them why they said no on the survey, they'll go through and they'll explain, well, there's this particular Greek word in the Nicene Creed, homoousios, which means being of the same substance. And that invokes a Neoplatonic idea of substance-essence dualism. And I'm not sure substance-essence dualism is actually true. And so, because I'm not sure that substance-essence dualism is actually true, and there are Neoplatonic underpinnings in the philosophy of the Nicene Creed, I'm not sure I can affirm it. They are, for all intents and purposes, a standard Orthodox Christian. They're just not sure about the Neoplatonic ontology that's assumed in parts of the Nicene Creed. And so, if you put out a survey, you would get a whole bunch of people saying, no, I don't affirm the Nicene Creed, when in practice they actually do, and they would usually defend it quite fervently. But because there's that like sort of 1% of doubt, it's always easier to say no to a yes or no question, or to say disagree to a question and be intellectually honest and precise, than it is to say yes. Because if you say yes, that means you're signing on to every single thing. But if you say no, that does mean you could be signing on to 90% of the things and still dissent. And so you get a lot of these like weird survey quirks with autistic people that you don't necessarily get with most people. Another problem is, so this is an example that I did where I put out a large survey, got over 500 autistic people to fill it out, just practicing autistic Christians, and it asked what their denomination was, and I put a box for other. And so many of them checked other. And then they would put like a paragraph long explanation saying, I go to an Anglican church and I participate in an Anglican church. However, Article 2 of the 39 articles endorses the Council of Chalcedon, and I'm not necessarily sure that, the Miaphysites are wrong about their beliefs. So I think I might dissent on the Council of Chalcedon, and so I'm not sure if I get to call myself and they'll give this really long explanation where they should have just checked Anglican. And from the perspective of me, the survey creator, I'm like, just press Anglican. It's close. We're going for close enough, but you get those problems as well. And that's just doing like surveys and gathering the information. There are even bigger problems when it comes to like selection bias and sampling bias and things like that, because autism is chronically underdiagnosed in the population. So there are a lot of undiagnosed autistic people walking around, and it is more underdiagnosed in specific communities. And so there is a lot of problem, especially you see it in autism research, where the research on autistic people is based on selected samples of people from groups that have high rates of autism diagnosis, and those groups tend to be more liberal, urban, progressive, and oftentimes they won't include the perspective of undiagnosed autistic people, because how do you survey a autistic person if they don't know they're autistic? And so you get a sort of selection effect where it will only select for the people who belong to social groups where rates of autism diagnosis are higher. And particularly for my research, and particularly for research on religiosity, religious groups, especially conservative religious groups, are far less likely to get autism diagnoses or search out autism diagnoses. And so a lot of autism and religion research gets a very heavy progressive skew, where they'll come away with the idea that autistic people are all like revolutionary socialist liberation theologians. But that's not at all the actual case. And especially online research of autistic people, researchers will use tags like hashtag actually autistic to identify autistic participants and then take those people's responses. But most autistic people don't actually use hashtag actually autistic to identify themselves. Most autistic people don't identify themselves openly as autistic, and the only people who do are typically people who belong to progressive, social justice oriented, activist type communities. And while those people are definitely still autistic, what it causes in autism research is this sort of positive feedback loop where the people that you survey are from this particular demographic, which makes you shape the way that autism is understood based on this demographic, which brings up more people in that demographic. And it's sort of this like self-reinforcing selection bias that just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And so I've been doing as much as I possibly can to correct for those biases, and doing as much as I can to make sure that that's not being reflected in my work. But like, this is just like a small sample of the difficulties and issues that come about when you're doing this particular research.
Yeah. It's difficult to survey neurotypical people's attitude to religion and belief and so forth. And the difficulties with autistic people are clearly multiplied. I wonder if we can go back to something that's come up and which is perhaps explained by the difficulties of sampling and so on. It's partly a popular stereotype and partly something that's found its way into academic writing. What I'm referring to is the idea that autistic people tend to be very much non-religious or even anti-religious. Richard Dawkins types, essentially, hyper-rational, people who think that religion's all nonsense. But clearly it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, and I would say a few things on that. So, sometimes stereotypes are irrational and don't really describe a group, but sometimes they do. And I think the stereotype that autistic people tend to be these sort of like hyper rationalist atheist materialists is it's not entirely true, but that idea didn't come out of a vacuum. Like, there are a lot of autistic people who do fit that description. If you especially look at autism in the new atheist movement, there's a lot of it. And it's actually really funny to watch like a lot of the new atheist YouTubers who are now these days sort of slowly all coming out with an autism diagnosis. It's really funny how many of those that's happened to. But the overall trend from all the data that I've been able to find, and from like meta-analysis of all of the limited number of studies that are out there, do show that autism does play a role in religiosity, or more accurately, a lack of religiosity. The extent to which autism plays a role is a lot more complicated. And so while overall autistic people are less likely to be religious, one of the biggest factors is what sort of environment is that autistic person in. So one thing that I was able to find in my research that some other people haven't pointed out is that there's this sort of effect. So if you sample autistic people in, let's take two cities. So Toronto, Canada, which is generally speaking more secular, and I don't know, somewhere in Texas, Houston, Texas, where you will typically have more religiosity. Basically, what I found is that autistic people in both cases are less likely to be religious, but in high religious or high saturation religious environments in which religion is sort of in the water, the degree to which autistic people are less likely to be religious is significantly less than in secular environments. In secular environments, we are significantly less likely to be religious than average person in our same demographic when you control for factors like gender and socioeconomic status, race, those types of things. Yeah, the stereotype exists for a reason. But that being said, just because autistic people are less likely to be religious doesn't mean that there aren't still religious autistic people out there. And one of the big parts of my research is kind of trying to explain why autistic people are less likely to be religious.
This brings us to the question of what it means to be religious, which is an enormous question, obviously. It's the sort of thing that scholars like to debate. Is religion a matter of belief? Is it a matter of practicing one's religion? Is it an identity, etc.? And it seems to me that one issue that exists here is that being religious as an autistic person differs from the phenomenon of being religious as a neurotypical person. We use the same word or concept to describe two different experiences.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's true. And I find religious studies very, very interesting. And I find the ways that we do classification interesting. And one of the schools that I would probably think about more when I'm thinking about religiosity would be one that would look at different sorts of religious practice. So we have a tendency to say, Christianity, but what is Christianity? Well, Christianity involves like the Oriental Orthodox and hyper charismatic Pentecostals. And the gulf between those is so huge. They're both religious and they're both Christian, but like what it's like the things that they're doing and the way that they're doing it is so fundamentally different that defining what religion is a very difficult thing, and defining it for autistic people is even more difficult. There's this common sentiment that you find in autistic Christian circles. I find one of the most common sentiments. There's this phrase, especially in evangelical subcultures, that comes up where they say, I'm not religious, or it's not a religion, it's a relationship. Or another one that you find more in secular contexts is, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. And autistic people will often take the complete opposite approach, and they'll say, I'm religious, not spiritual, or it's not a relationship, it's a religion. And so the way that autistic people practice religion tends to be a lot more sacramental, a lot more ritualistic, a lot more repetitive, and very deeply intellectually engaged, but not particularly emotionally engaged. And for a lot of Christian practice, a lot of Christians would say, well, that's not actually Christianity. Like they'll make this differentiation and say, well, there's head knowledge and heart knowledge, and you have head knowledge, but you need this heart knowledge. Like you need to know and understand Jesus in this way. And autistic people, generally speaking, just don't. The way we think about relationships, the way we process relationships, the way we process a lot of that social data that most people naturally process one way, we process it completely differently. And so when you have religious practice that involves a lot of those heavy relational elements, what happens to a group of people who don't really engage with those same sorts of relational ways of thinking? And so basically with autistic people, you get just to be clear, this is not every autistic person, but the majority of autistic people, around 80 to 85% of autistic people, would practice a non-relational form of Christianity, where the emphasis is on things like the sacraments and ritual and structured repetitive prayer, and their spiritual expression is far more based on intellectualizing and understanding things and researching things and thinking about things than it is actually participating in a sort of emotive religious experience.
So autistic people are high church, basically, smells and bells.
Yeah, so that's actually something really interesting that I found in my research. There's a phenomena that I call high church migration. A lot of autistic people will end up leaving Christianity, and the reasons for that are very varied and complicated. And I think we spend like 6 episodes in my podcast just going over all the different reasons that autistic people leave. But the ones that stay, I found, especially as they get older, there's this phenomena I've dubbed high church migration, where autistic people will, if they stay in Christianity, they will almost certainly move to a high church smells and bells. I'm in the Anglo-Catholic Church, or the Anglo-Catholic side of the Anglican Church of Canada. You'll find a lot of us convert to Catholicism or Orthodoxy. You find an enormous amount of autistic Christians in sort of high church Lutheran expression, especially in like the American Midwest, I think it is. Basically where there are high concentrations of Lutherans, you find a lot of autistic people, especially in the high church side of the Lutheran tradition. And so yeah, if there's a sort of ritualistic high church expression, autistic people will flock to it for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, it's interesting. And you mentioned that there are autistic people who, like other groups, fall away from Christianity. And I know that you've looked into that. And I know that one reason that you've identified for that is that autistic people have a greater likelihood, on average, of being LGBT. And that can come into conflict with some of the more, shall we say, backward looking expressions of Christianity.
Yeah, there are a lot of reasons why autistic people leave the church. I try to make sure that I properly articulate it, but the most common reason that autistic people leave the church is conflicts with doctrine and ideology. The reason a person leaves the church is never monocausal, right? There's never like one particular reason that autistic people leave. And so the model that I use to describe autistic deconversion is sort of what I call the cognitive dissonance pressure cooker. Cognitive dissonance is like the mental discomfort from holding two opposite or contradictory views. And autistic people are very sensitive to cognitive dissonance, more so than the average person. The things that cause us cognitive dissonance are much greater. What causes cognitive dissonance tends to cause more cognitive dissonance for autistic people, and we generally speaking have less of a capacity. And one of the major sources of cognitive dissonance is hardline doctrine and ideology. So for me, I'll just use myself as a case study. I was raised with like 6 day creationism. Young Earth, 6 day creationism. The world is 6,000 years old. There, it was created in a literal 7 days. Genesis is true in a very literalistic, straightforward, rationalist way. And yeah, then I went to university, and I quickly realized that yeah, that's not even remotely true. Like there's a lot of really good evidence for evolution, and like one of the characteristics of autistic thinking is it tends to have a component of all or nothing, black and white thinking. Like it's either completely true or it's not true at all. And so like the insistence that 7 day creation was true versus the I think obvious science that it's not caused a lot of issues for me. I was able to resolve it, but then having come in conflict with evolution, I then started looking into things like textual criticism and the study of the New Testament, and started getting really into historical critical reconstruction of the New Testament. And I found a lot of the assumptions that I had previously made about the Bible, about doctrine, about the way we should be thinking about things, just wasn't compatible with Christianity, and so I left. I should clarify. I said I deconstructed and left the faith. I have since come back, but yeah. So
Yeah.
sometimes I forget to let people know that I am a Christian now. Like I came back to Christianity, but for a very long time I was sort of new atheist, and in that camp after I deconverted, spent a lot of time there.
Yeah. And that takes us into another interesting area, which is conversion or evangelization. And you've made the point that the techniques that Christian evangelists use may work on neurotypical people, but they have the opposite effect on autistic people.
So when you think about evangelism, like evangelism is sort of like marketing, right? You're trying to sell people on the idea that Christianity is a thing you should do. And so evangelism always has a target. Like it always has a target audience who you want to aim for. And one of the things I point out in the podcast is that target is never autistic people, right? So autistic people have their own preferences, their own things that they care about, their own preferred ways of engaging with things. And autistic people just are never on mind when you're creating an evangelism event. Like if you're looking at a college university experience or evangelism event, there's lots of icebreakers, lots of people talking, high energy, lots of emotional expression. The topics aren't going to be very deep. Like it's not going to be super intellectually engaging. It's mostly going to focus on big questions and questions of, what is meaning, or like, are you missing something, or, is there a God-shaped hole in your heart? And none of these things resonate with autistic people. Autistic conversion is complicated, and reconversion is even more complicated. Autistic conversion stories are like very, very heavily feature intellectual debate and argument and intellectual engagement at a level that I don't think most people are ready for or prepared for. Like a general story that you'll hear is an autistic person wants to join Christianity because they're kind of lonely and they don't have friends, and they see this social group and they think, if I could join this religion, I can join this social group and then I'll be accepted and I can have friends and everything like that. And so their conversion to Christianity, however, will involve a extremely lengthy, detailed intellectual investigation into Christianity, because they need to make sure that they can intellectually work with it before anything. And most evangelism materials aren't built to start with, hey, here's a sociological analysis of Christian origins, how they developed, why Christianity is even a thing, and how Christianity started and why it has all these assumptions in it. But that's what autistic people want to know, right? That's what a lot of us want to know before we join it. Like, what is this thing? How does it function? What are the mechanisms? Why are we believing these sorts of things? And there's this like incredibly high bar of like intellectual entry that you need to cross before you can actually get into it, that I find a lot of people just aren't ready to help people cross. It's something I do a lot of. So a lot of times campus ministers will say, hey, I got this guy and I think he's autistic. Do you want to talk to him for me? And I will. And that usually involves like very, very long meandering discussions about anthropology, sociology, and like the political history of Christianity and why it's formed to do the various things that it does. There's also just like another practical problem. So this is a problem that is talked about a lot in autism advocacy circles. It's called the double empathy problem. And so the double empathy problem is this idea. So there's a stereotype about autistic people, which isn't true, which is that we lack empathy. And it isn't that autistic people lack empathy. Some of us do. Like every population, you will have people who are all across the bell curve distribution. I expect the empathy bell curve distribution for autistic people would probably look a lot different than it would for non-autistic people, but that's probably a discussion for another time. But basically, all I'm saying is that autistic people don't actually lack empathy. We just find it very hard to understand and relate to non-autistic people. Autistic people are very good at empathizing with other autistic people, but not necessarily good at empathizing with non-autistic people. And the same is true for non-autistic people. Non-autistic people are good at empathizing with other non-autistic people, but they aren't good at empathizing with autistic people. And so this sort of creates a weird problem where both sides have the same communication deficit. So autistic people struggle to communicate with non-autistic people, and non-autistic people struggle to communicate with autistic people. And so it's only considered like a disability for the autistic people, because basically, just from a perspective of population dynamics, we make up like 1 to 2% of the population. And so because we make up 1 to 2% of the population, it's a problem for us, but it's not a problem for the other 98%. And so this also factors a lot into evangelism and conversion, because a lot of people doing evangelism aren't autistic. They don't understand autistic people. They're not very good at relating to them. They're not very good at understanding the questions they're asking, or why they're asking them, or the ways that autistic people are thinking about Christianity. And there are just all these various different problems. And a lot of times you'll get campus ministers talking to me who will say things like, I'm talking to this guy and he's just not picking what I'm laying down. Can you maybe have a go at it? And then I'll talk to him and he'll make the exact same complaint about the campus minister, saying, this person doesn't understand what I'm saying. He's not understanding my questions, and he's not actually answering my questions. And a lot of that comes down to just a communication gap that I think naturally exists between autistic and non-autistic people.
Yes, yes, indeed. And this, of course, pertains to the very important question of what lessons your research has, both for autistic people and for neurotypical people. If you were to summarize the main lessons that emerged from your research, what would you say they are?
Yeah, so there's this phrase that you find a lot on autism communities, particularly ex-Christian autistic communities, which is the sentiment that is essentially Christianity is a religion by neurotypicals and for neurotypicals. And what they're saying by that isn't that like Christianity has a no autism allowed sign on it. That's not what they're trying to say. What they're trying to say is the way that Christianity is practiced, the way that churches are run, the way that we express ourselves, the way that we engage, all of these things are done assuming that every person in the parish is not autistic. And the people in the church are generally not autistic. The people messaging in the church are generally speaking not autistic. And so you have people who aren't autistic speaking with the assumption that no one else is autistic. And so it creates this sort of very isolating effect on autistic people. I don't think there's anything in autism that makes us less likely to be religious by nature. I think it's just the way that we practice religion in the modern English-speaking West. I think one of the big takeaways is that the way we practice Christianity is often done assuming that your brain works in a certain way, assuming that your brain functions in a certain way. And my response whenever someone tells me Christianity is a religion by neurotypicals and for neurotypicals, my answer to that is, I understand why it feels that way, but it doesn't have to be. And I think that's the biggest takeaway is Christianity is very diverse, right? There are so many ways of practicing Christianity under the sort of umbrella of a general broad orthodoxy, or like a mere Christianity. There are so many ways of practicing Christianity. And there are ways that autistic people practice Christianity. And there are ways that autistic people practice Christianity that are almost unique to autistic people. I talk about this in episode 8 of the podcast, where I talk about something I just call autistic Christianity, which is what Christianity looks like when it's expressed through an autistic lens. And I think one of the big takeaways that I want to do is there's phrase with autistic people online where they're talking about their struggles with Christianity. And they'll often say something to the effect of, it feels like I'm trying to fit the square peg of autism into the round hole of Christianity. And a big part of my research and a big part of my project is just trying to say, but there's also a square hole right next to it. Just put the square peg of autism into the square hole of autistic Christianity. This is a totally normal and perfectly legitimate thing. And I think it's something that's worth pursuing.
Yes. Yes. And another question that arises is whether there are lessons for other religious traditions. Has your research taken in people who are religiously active in communities other than Christianity? Is there a research base of autistic people who are committed Muslims or Hindus, for example?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, and that's just not something that I have had the time or the expertise to go into. So I felt really comfortable doing Christianity because Christianity is something that I know a lot about. I've done a lot of academic study of Christianity. I'd hesitate to go into something like Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam because I know within Christianity there are just so many nuances that I've had to learn and pick up on that I'm not sure I would know how to learn or pick up on in Islam. I suspect this is sort of more anecdotal from knowing autistic people who belong to different religious traditions. I expect that Abrahamic monotheisms would mostly track the same way they do with Christianity. I expect there would be fewer issues with something like Judaism, but I think the types of things that you encounter in Islam would be very similar to the types of things you would encounter in Christianity. And this is mostly speculation and based on some anecdotal evidence talking to Muslim autistics and Jewish autistics. The Jewish autistics tend to have much fewer problems than the Christians and the Muslims. Because a lot of the way that modern Judaism is practiced is much more orthopraxic than it is orthodoxic. So a lot of it is based on practice and ritual and doing things and less about, do you adhere to this specific way of thinking and doing things? Judaism is like an ethnic religion, right? When it comes to Buddhism, I know a lot of autistic people, especially autistic people who are sort of involved in the rationalist sphere, like the sort of Sam Harris secular Buddhism side of things. Some of them practice Buddhism, like a non-theistic secular form of Buddhism that's kind of popular in the West. But I don't have any data on Hinduism or different types of Buddhism. But those are interesting things. I just don't think that I have the particular expertise that I would need to successfully navigate those and pick up on all the complications and nuances. Because just to give you an example, I interview autistic people and I ask them questions like, why did you leave Christianity? And some of them will say, well, I learned that, Jesus was invented in the 300s at the Council of Nicaea in order to, create Christianity to control the Roman Empire. And I know an enormous amount of Christianity, an enormous amount to say, oh, you just believe something that's just historically false and easily provably wrong. And I don't have that ability to do that with Islam. I have looked at Mormonism, mostly because Mormonism is very culturally similar to Christianity. And basically, the way I describe Mormonism is it has all the same issues that Christianity does, plus more. For autistic people, there are a lot more issues with Mormonism and the expressions of Mormon autistics that you find really high rates of deconversion amongst Mormon populations. But yeah, those are my thoughts on other religious interactions. If anyone is listening to this and they're interested in learning how I did my research and want to turn it on other people or other religious groups, I'd be more than happy to chat.
Well, you've certainly produced an enormous amount of fascinating data. And one question that emerges is what the next step is. Are you looking for new worlds to conquer now? What are the new research questions that are emerging?
Yeah, so one thing that I'm doing a lot of these days is just documenting specific autistic religious subcommunities. So autistic people often don't exist on a continuum, they exist in clusters. What I mean by that is autistic people will tend to gravitate towards specific intellectual clusters, and you don't find a lot of in between those clusters. And so one of the things that I'm doing now is I'm just going through and documenting these various different clusters of autistic people, why they believe the things they do, how they got into that, what sorts of things motivate them and push them into these various different autistic subcommunities and specifically autistic religious subcommunities, and sort of going through all that. So, I'm currently looking at online communities of autistic trans religious people, or autistic trans Christians, I should say. And also, on the flip side, looking at their counterpart, which is autistic gender critical Christians. Right now, what I'm doing is I'm just interviewing people from as many groups that I can find, just hearing out what they have to say, why they joined that subcommunity, how they got to that subcommunity, and everything in between. So that's currently where my research is just finding these groups and documenting them. One of the more interesting ones that I found were a group of Latin Mass autistic furries. So if you don't know the internet terminology, that maybe don't look that up. But that's a group that I found. And so just documenting them, trying to understand them, trying to understand why they chose their specific subcommunity and how they got into it.
Okay. Well, it all sounds very interesting, and I'm sure I speak for our listeners when I wish you the very best of luck in pursuing your future research directions. We'll have to leave it there for now as we're out of time, but thank you very much for taking the time to share the work that you've been doing, which is really fascinating as well as very important. I've been talking to Jonathan Machnee, who runs the Christianity on the Spectrum podcast. And Jonathan, thank you very much for speaking with me today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's been good talking.